City. He loved the Lord, but he didn't think that there was much that he could do for him. But he did finally accept the church's invitation to become an inner city missionary. In July 1857, he started walking up and down the streets, handing out tracts and talking to anyone who would listen to him about Jesus. But he wasn't having the most success. So God put on his heart to try prayer. So he printed out some more tracts and he passed it out to anyone and everyone. He invited them to come together from 12 to 1 o'clock on Wednesday to pray. He passed out hundreds of these flyers and he posted them everywhere. Wednesday came, no one showed up. So he got down on his knees and he started to pray. For 30 minutes, he prayed by himself, and finally 5 people walked in. The next week, he had 20 people. The week after that, he had 30 to 40 people. Then they finally decided that they should meet every day from 12 to 1 to pray for their city. Before long, a few ministers started coming, and they say, we need to take this back to our churches. And within 6 months, there were over 5,000 prayer groups meeting every day all over New York. Soon the word broke out all over the country. Prayer groups was started in Philadelphia and Detroit and Washington, D.C. In fact, the president at the time would go almost every noon to a prayer meeting. By 1859, there were more than 15,000 cities in America that were having downtown prayer meetings every day at noon. And thousands were brought to Christ. But one of the greatest things that I love about this revival is that there's no famous preacher that's connected to it. It all started with one man who wanted to pray. You know, if God is going to move in our communities, in our state, in our country, then we need people who are willing to pray a revival prayer. What does revival prayers look like? Well, our text for today comes from a small verse out of the book of Jonah. But first, let me set the stage for you. God called Jonah to go to Nineveh to save that wicked people. But Jonah didn't want to go. He didn't want them to be saved. He knew how gracious and merciful God was, and he knew that he would forgive them if they repented. So he ran from God. He got on a boat and he started to travel, and God sent a storm, and Jonah knew that the storm was sent because of him. So he said, throw me overboard and the storm will go away. So they threw him overboard. He was swallowed by a fish. He spent 3 days in that fish until the fish vomited him up on a beach near Nineveh. So he began to preach to them, and they repented. But Jonah was upset about it. So he goes up on a hill, and he's starting to look down, waiting for God to send fire down on these people, and God never does. But after Jonah's story, the king of Nineveh is telling the people what they're going to do. And in chapter 3, verse 8, he says, but let people and animals be covered with sackcloth. Let everyone call urgently on God. Let them give up their evil ways and their violence. And I think within that small verse, we find 3 characteristics of what a revival prayer looks like. Revival prayer is characterized by brokenness. That is what the king meant when he says, I want the whole city to be covered in sackcloth. Looking back at verse 5, when Jonah's preaching this sermon, everyone begins to fast. And fasting in the Old Testament was a way of humbling yourself. The way that you show that you are broken, that you show that you are desperate, that you're looking for God. God once said, if my people would humble themselves. You know, God will visit when people reach a point of desperation. When we surrender that pride, the idea that we can do pretty good on our own, and we get down on our knees and admit that things are not going the way that they should, I think that's when God will visit his people. God is saying that the first thing that you need in prayer is humility. Do you remember when Jesus told the parable of the 2 men who went into the temple to pray? One came in, he started strutting his stuff, saying to God how glad he was of who he was and that he wasn't like the other guy. He says, I'm religious and I'm proud of it. And he begins to list off all the things that he has done good for God. But then the second man walks in. He said that there's nothing worthy about him. He says, God, I am a sinner. Please have mercy. Who did God listen to? Who did he hear? David said in Psalms 51, 16 through 17, You, O Lord, do not delight in sacrifice, or I would bring it. You do not pleasure in burnt offerings. The sacrifice of God is a broken heart and a broken and contrite, or a broken spirit and a broken and contrite heart. Not only broken hearts are big enough for God to dwell in. Broken hearts are very rare these days, though. But even more rare are broken churches, or at least churches that will admit that they're broken. You know, most people are pretty satisfied with the state of the church today. Are you? But do you think the church in America is actually pretty healthy? Because I think most of us do, or at least that's what our actions are showing. Because it doesn't seem like many of us are getting down on our knees praying that he will revive us. So we must think everything's okay. So why do you think we're so satisfied with how the church is today? Well, I think first of all, it's because we compare ourselves to the world and not to the New Testament church or the church that God has called us to become. You know, if we always compare ourselves to the world, then yeah, we're always going to feel pretty good about ourselves. But when we compare ourselves to the New Testament church or the church that God has called us to be, the only thing that we can do is humble ourselves. Be broken and pray that God will come. I don't think revival will come until we admit that we're broken. And we begin to take those steps to revive ourselves. Look at the church in Sardis in Revelations 3:1. Jesus says, I know your works. You have the reputation of being alive, but you're dead. Is that us? Is that the church in America? Is that what it looks like? You know, another reason I think we're satisfied with the state of the church is because we're comfortable. We don't like change. Because if we're not on the right path, that means something needs to change. But many of us will say, but I don't like change. I'm comfortable with where I am. And all of those new people that might come into the church that don't know how to act in church, do we really want them here? My question is, where's your focus? Is your focus on eternity, as we looked at last week? Or is your focus on your own comfort? No, revival prayer is not for people who are unwilling to mourn about the state of the church. Revival prayer is when God's people get on their knees with tears, with hurting hearts, asking God to intervene in their lives. This is what God is waiting to hear. Revival prayer is also characterized by urgency. The king of Nineveh said, I want you to put on sackcloth. And I want you to call urgently on God. Urgently means that there's a sense of emergency. There's intensity there. People who are praying revival prayers are those people who pray long, hard, intense, and unyielding prayers that comes from the depths of their heart. Some people will say, well, I prayed for revival in my marriage for a whole week and nothing happened. It's not a revival prayer. Or I've been praying for a whole month for revival prayer in my church, but nothing's happened. It's not a revival prayer either. Those who pray revival prayers are desperate. They're wholehearted, never-ending petitioners of God. They never quit. They never give up. D.L. Moody was a famous evangelist from Chicago, and he went on vacation to England. And he wasn't planning on preaching anywhere. He was on a sabbatical, but he ran into a preacher that said, Mr. Moody, you're so well known here. Would you like to come to our church and speak? So he went the next Sunday morning and he preached. And that afternoon, Moody wrote in his journal that that was the deadest crowd that he has ever preached to. And the only thing worse than preaching to a dead crowd like that is that he promised to preach the next day. But he did go back the next night. And about halfway through the sermon, something happened. The people started to come to life. And he felt compelled to ask that if anyone would like to become a Christian, if they would please stand. And a lot of people stood up. And he didn't know what to do. So he said, well, maybe you don't understand what I'm asking. So when we're dismissed, if you want to become a Christian, come over to this small room and we're discussing. When the services was over, he went over to the room and the room was packed. And Moody said, I don't know what this means. And the minister said, well, I think it means that you need to come back tomorrow and preach again. But the next day, Moody got on a train and he left for Ireland to continue his vacation. But as soon as he got off the train, there was a memo waiting for him. And it said, come back, revival has broken out. So Moody got back on the train, he went back there, he preached 10 straight nights, and 400 people responded to the invitation. And Moody couldn't understand what happened. Those people who were dead, something changed in them. But come to find out, there was an 80-something-year-old widow named Mary Ann who had read one of his sermons in a newspaper. And she began to pray every single day that God would send D.L. Moody to her church. That's a revival prayer. What does Paul tell us in 1 Thessalonians 5:17? He doesn't say to worship without ceasing or fellowship without ceasing or even preaching without ceasing. All of those are good things. But he says praying without ceasing. In Luke 11:1, the disciples asked Jesus, they said, teach us to pray. Notice they didn't say, teach us what to say. They said, teach us to pray. Teach us to pray the way that you do. Immediately after that question, Jesus began to teach the only two parables on prayer. The parable about the widow who was going to the judge and the parable about the guy who needed bread in the middle of the night. Let me try to sum up those two parables in 3 words. Don't give up. The main thing that Jesus is saying about prayer is don't give up. Keep on praying. You know, we need that type of commitment today. We need to be like Jacob. You remember when he saw the angel of the Lord and he began to wrestle with him all night. And in the morning, the angel said, let me go. And Jacob said in Genesis 32:26, I will not let you go unless you bless me. Now, I challenge you to pray that way. I challenge you to pray that God would send revival to Southern Illinois saying, God, I'm not going to give up until it comes. Because we've seen, as we've seen last week, we need it. Think about what was going on in Nineveh. They knew that if they didn't repent, that if revival didn't come to them, they were going to be destroyed. But what's going on with us? I think it's worse. Because people, or eternity is hanging in the balance. There's people that's heading to eternal damnation. It's worse. There should be urgency within our prayer. And revival prayer is characterized by holiness. The king says, I want you to put on sackcloth. I want you to pray urgently to God, and I want you to give up your evil ways. Now we see this revival type prayer in another place in 2 Chronicles 7:14. He says, if you will humble yourself, brokenness. If you will pray and seek my face, urgency. And if you turn from your wicked ways, holiness. Isaiah 55:6-7 says, seek the Lord while he may be found. Call on him while he is near. Let the wicked forsake his ways and the evil man his thoughts. Let him turn to the Lord, and he will have mercy on him, for he will freely pardon. And David says in Psalm 66:18, if I had cherished sin in my life, the Lord would not have listened. No, the chief thing that won't won't let revival come to America or our church or even within us is that we will not confess our sins. God did not promise to respond to any prayer of the people who cherish sin in their life. Now, I know that's hard to hear, but it's the truth. Did you remember what James, the brother of Jesus, says in chapter 5, verse 16? He doesn't say that prayer is powerful and effective, which it is. He doesn't say that the prayers of men is powerful and effective. He says the prayer of a righteous man is powerful and effective. God will forgive. He will hear. He will heal when holy people pray. God will turn and hear our prayers when we turn to Him and obey. But there's one thing that I want us to understand. Holiness does not mean perfection. We're still going to stumble. We're still going to mess up. We're still going to have sin in our lives. But what it means is that we're not cherishing that sin. We don't love that sin. And no matter what the consequences are, we're still going to continue in that sin. That's not holiness. But knowing that we're broken, knowing that we're sinful, knowing that we mess up, and we're covered with the holiness of Christ, that's what's meant here. You know, some of us come to church every Sunday with unrepented hearts. There's anger, there's jealousy, there's malice, there's lust, there's greeds, there are all kinds of sins. And we can pray and we can pray and we can pray until our face turns blue. But without holiness, I don't think God will respond. That's what they did in Nineveh. They humbled themselves. They called urgently on the Lord. And they turned from their sins. And we see in Jonah 3:10, it says, "And when God saw what they did and how they turned from their evil ways, He had compassion and did not bring upon them the destruction that He had threatened." No, let me tell you, if we are serious about being His people, about finding God in our lives in a powerful way, we must make for sure that our hands are holy and our hearts are pure. I want to close by telling you another story. I started out this sermon today telling you the great revival, prayer revival that started out in 1857. It moved from New York to Detroit to Buffalo to Washington, D.C., then it moved to Philadelphia. And one of the leaders in Philadelphia was a young man named Dudley Ting. And he started a noonday prayer meeting at a local YMCA, and some days nearly 5,000 people would show up to pray. And one day Dudley stood up and he read from Exodus 10:11 that says, "Go ye that are men and serve the Lord." And he said, "I'd rather my right arm be cut off than tell you those words." Later that week, Dudley went into the country to see some of his friends. And when he was in a barn at his friend's place, he got his arm caught in the corn threshing machine and it cut one of his major arteries. They took him into the bed. They tried to save his life, but he had lost too much blood. So his friends began to gather around him, and they asked, "What do you want us to tell the people?" And he looked at him and he says, "Tell them to stand up for Jesus." So the next Sunday, his good friend George Duffield stood up at the church and he preached a sermon in memory of his friend. And this is what he said. He said, "I just finished writing a poem in honor of Dudley, and I'd like to read it to you." He goes on and says, stand up for Jesus, ye soldiers of the cross. Lift high His royal banner, it must not suffer loss. From victory unto victory, His army shall He lead, till every foe is vanquished, for Christ is Lord indeed. Stand up for Jesus, the triumph call obey. Forth to the mighty conflict in this His glorious day. Ye that are men now serve Him against unnumbered foes. Let courage rise with danger and strength to strength oppose. Stand up for Jesus, the strife will not be long. This day the noise of battle, the next the victor's song. To him that overcometh a crown of life shall be. He with the King of glory shall reign eternally. And all across America, city after city would meet together to pray, and they would sing this song, stand up for Jesus. It's time for us to decide, are we going to stand up for Jesus or not? Some of you here today may need to give your life to him. Others may need to renew that strength that you once had. So whatever your decision is, come now as we stand and sing.